In the dark hours of the 9th of November 1938, a shiver ran through the spine of the German Reich. The streets of cities like Berlin, Frankfurt, and Munich echoed with the sounds of breaking glass as Jewish-owned stores, buildings, and synagogues were deliberately vandalized or set aflame, a grim omen of the systematic destruction and brutal anti-Semitism that would soon engulf the continent. What has become known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, marked a terrifying and deadly new phase of the Nazi persecution of the Jews, a night when thugs rampaged with impunity as the police stood by and simply watched it happen. The exact numbers are not precise, but more than 90 Jews died that night. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and incarcerated in concentration camps. This was no act of random violence. It was orchestrated from the very top. While the infringement of Jewish rights had been slowly advancing for years, Kristallnacht was on an entirely different level. What had been open anti-Semitism and segregation turned into violence and murder that would tragically foreshadow the horrors of the Holocaust. Germany, 1938. Kristallnacht didn't come out of the blue. It was the culmination of years of escalating persecution under Adolf Hitler's regime. Since coming to power in 1933, the Nazis had steadily imposed restrictions on Jews, stripping them of their rights, their businesses, their dignity. These laws culminated in the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited them from marrying or engaging in sexual relations with persons of German or related blood. Anti-Jewish propaganda permeated German society, fueled by state-controlled media that depicted Jews as subhumans and enemies of the state. But until Kristallnacht, the violence had been relatively isolated and primarily bureaucratic. However, by the late 1930s, violent assaults, arbitrary arrests, and the confiscation of property became routine. Jews were increasingly isolated economically and socially, barred from public spaces, restricted in their professions, and subjected to sporadic yet terrifying acts of violence from both the Sturmabteilung, the SA, as well as the general populace. It was clear that this simmering cauldron of hatred would boil over at some point. The Nazis were itching for an excuse to take greater action against the Jews. And that excuse came on the 7th of November 1938 in Paris, when Herschel Grinspan, a German born to Polish Jewish parents, murdered German diplomat Ernst von Rath. Born in Hanover, Germany in 1921 to Polish Jewish parents, Grinspan experienced firsthand the growing hostility towards Jews in Nazi Germany. His situation worsened dramatically following the Polish government's 1938 decree that the consulate must validate all passports of Polish citizens living abroad, an attempt to prevent the mass return of Jews to Poland. In October 1938, the Nazi government expelled approximately 17,000 Jews of Polish citizenship from Germany in a brutal operation. Grinspan's parents and siblings were among those forced into the no-man's land at the border between Poland and Germany, where they were stranded without shelter or sustenance. The news of his family's dire circumstances and the humiliating conditions they endured profoundly affected Grinspan. Feeling desperate and powerless, he decided to act against the Nazi regime, which he held responsible for his family's suffering. On November 7th, 1938, Grinspan purchased a revolver and a box of bullets and went to the German embassy in Paris. He asked to speak with an embassy official and was eventually taken to the office of Ernst von Rath, a 29-year-old diplomat. After a brief exchange, Grinspan shot von Rath several times, critically wounding him. The young man surrendered immediately to the French police, allegedly declaring, "In the name of 17,000 persecuted Jews, I had to do it. My people are being destroyed. I had to protest in a way that would make the whole world listen." Von Rath died from his injuries 2 days later on the 9th of November. The assassination provided Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's chief propagandist, who at the time was somewhat shamefaced after details of an affair had emerged, along with the ineffectiveness of his propaganda campaign during the Sudetenland crisis, with the perfect pretext needed to launch a state-sanctioned wave of violent pogroms against the Jewish community. The death was portrayed by Nazi officials not as an act of a desperate individual protesting against an oppressive regime, but as evidence of a vast Jewish conspiracy against the German people. The assassination triggered immediate reactions throughout Nazi Germany. On the evening of the 9th of November, as von Rath's death was announced, Goebbels and other top Nazi leaders who were assembled for the annual commemoration of the 1923 beer hall putsch in Munich agreed to initiate a nationwide pogrom, a violent riot incited with the aim of massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, particularly the Jews. SA paramilitary forces and Hitler Youth were mobilized along with other Nazi sympathizers to attack Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues. They wanted to present it as a spontaneous public outcry against Jews, but it was anything but. Kristallnacht was executed with chilling efficiency and brutality. Across Germany and annexed Austria, synchronized attacks were launched against Jewish communities. The SA, often wearing civilian clothes to give the appearance of spontaneous public action, led these attacks. They were joined by numerous civilians who either participated in the violence or looted Jewish property amidst the chaos. One of the primary targets during Kristallnacht was synagogues, symbols of Jewish community and faith. Over 1,400 synagogues were set on fire and many were completely destroyed. Firefighters were present, but had orders to only prevent the flames from spreading to adjacent area-owned buildings. Sacred Torah scrolls and religious artifacts were desecrated, and entire congregations saw their places of worship simply reduced to rubble. Jewish-owned shops and department stores had their windows smashed and their contents destroyed or stolen, an image that contributed to the name Night of Broken Glass. Approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed during the pogrom, while residential homes were not spared either, with SA troops breaking into homes, vandalizing them, and terrorizing the inhabitants. The violence of Kristallnacht was ferocious and unprecedented, and it included physical attacks on Jewish individuals. At least 91 Jews were killed during the attacks, and many more were injured. In the immediate aftermath, about 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, mainly Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Hundreds more died in the following weeks due to the harsh conditions. In Berlin, the heart of the Nazi regime, the Jewish community experienced catastrophic losses. One of the most prominent victims was Martin Friedlander, a Jewish shop owner whose store was located in the bustling commercial district. His establishment, known for its fine fabrics, was utterly destroyed. SA men smashed the windows and looted valuable merchandise, leaving nothing but shattered glass and debris. Martin was later dragged out of his home, beaten in the street, and sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he endured months of harsh treatment. Nearby, the Fasanenstrasse synagogue, a cultural and spiritual hub for Jews in Berlin, was set on fire. Eyewitnesses recounted the blaze that illuminated the night sky, a beacon of the terror unfolding. In Frankfurt, the Klein family cowered in their home as thugs pounded on their front door. The family patriarch, Samuel Klein, was a respected doctor who served both Jewish and non-Jewish patients. On the night of Kristallnacht, his apartment and practice were ransacked, and he was dragged from his home in front of his wife and children and severely beaten. His oldest son, Michael, attempted to intervene and was also beaten. The large and ornate Bornplatz synagogue, a center of learning and community activities in Frankfurt since 1882, was set alight and destroyed. Vienna's Jewish community, one of the oldest and most vibrant in Europe, was devastated during Kristallnacht. Leopoldstadt, a district known as a predominantly Jewish part of Vienna, saw widespread destruction. One notable victim was Jacob Zimmert, an elderly tailor who lived in Vienna all his life. His small shop and apartment above, where he lived with his family, were ravaged as the mob stormed through the area. Jacob was later arrested and sent to Dachau concentration camp, where he died several months later. The Star Temple, the main synagogue in Vienna, was targeted but survived due to its location in a residential building that prevented the arsonists from setting it on fire without endangering the entire block. However, all other synagogues in Vienna were burned to the ground, a total of 42, in a systematic effort to obliterate Jewish religious life. In Munich, the historical and ideological birthplace of the Nazi Party, the pogrom was particularly intense. The Ahel Jacob Synagogue was destroyed completely. Julius Rosenbaum, a Jewish veteran of World War I, owned a small bookstore nearby, a popular meeting spot for Munich's Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals. His store was ransacked, and all the books were thrown into the streets and set alight. Julius was severely beaten in front of his neighbors and taken away. He was released, but died shortly after due to injuries sustained during the attack. For those who remained, it was a clear and terrifying indication of their increasing dangers. The aftermath of Kristallnacht was a society irreversibly altered. The event deeply ingrained fear and hopelessness into the Jewish community and marked a significant escalation towards the Holocaust. In response to international outrage, the Nazis employed propaganda to blame the Jews for the violence. As the debris of Kristallnacht was cleared, the broken glass became a symbol of the shattered lives and communities that would never be whole again. Communities that lived side by side for generations were now irreversibly splintered. The pogrom left deep scars not only on the streets and the buildings, but in the hearts and the minds of all who witnessed it, participated in it, or were victimized by it. The Nazi government soon imposed further punitive measures against the Jewish community. Rather than receiving sympathy or protection from the state, Jews were blamed for the destruction. Hermann Goering, a leading Nazi official, convened a meeting a few days after the pogrom, where it was decided that the Jewish community would be fined 1 billion Reichsmarks as a collective penalty. The fine was ostensibly to pay for the damages of Kristallnacht, although the actual intent was to cripple the Jewish population further. Additionally, the Nazis accelerated the Aryanization of Jewish businesses. This policy forced Jewish business owners to sell their establishments to non-Jewish Germans at a fraction of their actual value, effectively transferring economic resources from Jewish to Aryan hands. Many Jews lost their livelihoods, with little compensation pushing them further into poverty and despair. Shortly after the pogrom, the regime enacted a series of laws that increased the isolation of Jews. The Reich Ministry of the Interior imposed restrictions on the freedom of movement of Jews, banned them from entering cinemas, museums, and other cultural venues, and restricted their access to public areas such as parks and recreational facilities. In December 1938, the law on tenancies with Jews came into effect, which facilitated the eviction of Jews from their homes. Jews were pushed into segregated living, often in cramped and poor conditions, and non-Jews took over their properties. This further degradation of living conditions was a clear step towards the physical removal of Jews from German society. One of the Nazi regime's initial goals following Kristallnacht was to promote the emigration of Jews from the Reich. The violence and subsequent oppression measures made it clear that Jews had no future in Germany. Many Jews sought to leave, although emigration became increasingly difficult as many countries tightened their immigration policies. President Franklin D. Roosevelt set up the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees in response to the refugee crisis, but the international response was tepid, to say the least, and offered little real sanctuary to the vast numbers of Jews seeking to escape Nazi persecution. The Evian Conference, held a few months before Kristallnacht, had already demonstrated the reluctance of many countries to accept Jewish refugees. Kristallnacht can be seen as a turning point towards the final solution, the systematic genocide of the Jews that would be formalized at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. The pogrom demonstrated that the Nazi regime could commit mass acts of violence against Jews with little opposition from the German public. It also served as a grim rehearsal for the state-organized mass deportations and killings that would follow. In 1939, the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, was established to coordinate the persecution of Jews and other enemies of the state. This body played a crucial role in organizing the deportation of Jews to ghettos and eventually the extermination camps. The establishment of the RSHA marked the transition from sporadic and localized persecution of the Jews to their systematic and bureaucratic murder. As much as most Jews would have loved nothing more than to emigrate to safer countries, for the overwhelming majority, that's simply not what happened. The outbreak of war in 1939 gave the Nazis carte blanche to deal with their Jewish question in any way they saw fit. As Nazi land began to grow, deportation orders came into effect, and Jews across the expanding German Reich found themselves herded into cattle trucks and sent either first to desperately awful ghettos and then concentration camps, or directly to the camps that many of them never left. The final solution was horror, unimaginable scale, but the boldness, the hatred, the organizational streamlining, it really began on a cold November night in 1938. The night of the broken glass.